I'm doing standard of living and pop needs. These I'm gonna need to be able to pull up the Vicky wiki for, just because there's so many complicated things underneath this. So for just as a broad statement, I would consider this an advanced video, and encourage people to not watch it until they have played a little bit of Vicky 3 first, because they're gonna see this standard of living and they're gonna think, oh, that's a good number and I don't need to worry about whether it's going up or down. I just need to make it go up, and that's it. But I'm here to tell you that that is not true. Standard of living is a lot more complicated than that and does a lot of interesting and complex things and measures interesting and complex things. And so basically what I want to tell you is, if you are having fun in Victoria 3 right now and you feel like you're still learning a lot about like how to prioritize construction and all of that stuff, and how to do your laws, then I want to tell you to stop looking at this number. And instead, if you're going to look at any standard of living number, which you probably should for local things, it's to look at this local standard of living number. We will cover why in the next video that I'm going to do, which is going to be migrations. But just know that like having a really high local standard of living is going to make it so that that state is going to attract migration a lot better. And so you can do a lot of targeted construction to encourage people to move to different states. So even if you're pretty new, I would get comfortable with understanding how standard of living works locally. We'll go over that in the migration video. But this is mostly going to be about standard of living from a macro perspective. So let's just use the tooltips initially, and then we'll use the wiki when we need to. So standard of living. It measures a pop's living conditions with their material wealth as a baseline. Okay, it governs birth rate and mortality, sure. And every time it changes, they can become radical or loyal, whatever. The average in a state affects migration attraction. Cool. All right, so that's like a very basic description of things. But it's not really telling you like macro stuff. So the first thing that you need to know from a macro perspective when it comes to where this number is coming from is that this number is an average of the standard of living of all pops of all stratas. By and large, the easiest way to increase this is to increase the lower strata number. And the easiest way to increase the lower strata number is to get rid of all your goddamn peasants. All your goddamn peasants and all your slaves are pulling your standard of living down for your lower strata. And so if you want to dramatically increase the standard of living of your lower strata, and therefore dramatically increase the standard of living in your country, rather than obsessing over whether or not you should build like grain or clothes or whatever, get rid of all your peasants. Like that, just build, because peasants are incredibly limited in terms of the standard of living that they can accomplish, because most of their standard of living, most of their income, and therefore most of their wealth, which we'll pop over and show that to you, but most of that is coming from subsistence. So here's a subsistence farmer. So here we can see on this guy, we've got 10 wealth. So the basic the basic thing that determines your standard of living is your wealth. There are going to be modifiers that are going to come in there. Most of them are going to be discrimination events, but there will be things that will modify your standard of living. And then there will be other things that will modify the expected standard of living, which that is going to go up over time. And these things are also going to feed into each other, right? Because what determines your expected standard of living? One of the biggest things that's going to increase your expected standard of living is your literacy. And your literacy is going to go up as your wealth goes up, which means that as your standard of living is going to go up, your expected standard of living, kind of as a consequence of the wealth literacy loop, is also going to go up. And so the faster you grow your standard of living, the more people are going to get used to that standard of living being higher. They also will go down they will become radical as their standard of living goes down, even if they aren't below the minimum expected. But like if they're below the minimum expected because all of a sudden you ran out of the ability to keep the growth on, they'll get pretty mad. So it's going to tell you here that this is a pop growth rate, right? So you'll see here that it's at plus 30%. that's because of where their current standard of living is. So if we went to, what's a different one? Are all of the peasants at 10? I think all the peasants are at 10. Why do they have all these one population unemployed? You guys are crazy. All right, here's one. So here we have a different standard of living, a higher standard of living for these guys, but because of their annual deaths, their annual mortality from the dangerous working conditions here in child labor, then you see that they actually, even though they have a higher standard of living, they still have lower growth rate. So don't think that standard of living is the only way to affect growth rate, because it's not. There are lots and lots and lots of ways to affect growth rate, not the least of which is your mortality. So what determines whether or not your wealth is going to go down? Well, it's going to be based off of whether or not they have more income or more expenditures. Where do they have their little wealth thing? Oh, there it is. So the net income versus weekly expenses is going to determine whether or not they are progressing up towards the next wealth level or down towards the next wealth level, which is going to modify this number and its baseline up or down. And so having a higher weekly income than weekly expenses is just automatically going to drive up your standard of living regardless. And note, we haven't even gotten to the base price for their pop needs yet, right? We aren't talking about that yet, because that's not necessarily the thing that's going to determine whether or not your SOL is going up. The thing that's going to determine whether or not your SOL is going up is whether your net income is higher than your weekly expenses, or your weekly income is higher than your weekly expenses. And so who you're taxing, where you're taxing, what the needs are. The needs do factor into this, but all of those things put together, how do they measure up against your income? That's the important thing when it comes to determining is your SOL increasing or decreasing. So you can modify your SOL again by building the things that are relatively expensive in comparison to their expenditures. But keep in mind that some of these things are being bought in like extremely fractional amounts by gigantic number of pops, in which case the balance is, it's going to be hard to build this in such a way where it's actually going to give those people easier money. And remember, what's the number one thing that's going to hold down your lower strata SOL, and therefore the growth rate of your nation, is going to be peasants. Getting rid of your peasants is going to increase your SOL. So let's pop over to standard of living, just to like see what Paradox has written about this. So they've written stuff about birth rate is the percentage of, so as an important thing to keep in mind, that as your standard of living is lower, your birth rate is actually going to be higher on a percent chance. But the reason that your population is going to be held back in terms of its growth, partially it's going to be based off of whether or not there are dangerous working conditions, but it's also partially going to be based off of their standard of living, right? So here we see the birth rate on these Protestant evangelical clergymen plus 2.7%, and death is 1.3. So that is plus 2.7% nominally. And then after everyone was like dying, then it was, let's see, here we go. You see 4.9, 4.4. Lower SOLs actually have higher birth rates. So if you want to utilize SOL to just generate population, then what you want to do is, of course, increase your SOL, because then you have people who are being born, and then as you gradually increase the SOL in your country, then those people will stay with you and be alive longer and longer. And the reason that you don't want to just like immediately jump it to the highest level possible is that, of course, that will slow down your birth rate, and that will slow down your ability to grow into the mid and into the end game. But that's not the like really cool surprising thing about standard of living. The really cool surprising thing about standard of living, I think, is gonna start around here, 10 minutes. I'll put a little timer down below. Pop needs. So pop needs, the basket of goods that they buy, which is the thing that's going to determine whether or not they have a net income or a net loss right here, that needs is going to be derived from their wealth level, from their standard of living. And so what that means is if you are able to push a pop from like struggling into impoverished, then you change the basket of goods that they are looking for, which means that all of a sudden, instead of being exclusively looking here at these like lower tier like peasant goods, they are all of a sudden competing for real goods, including, most importantly, I think, services. Services is one of these things that you're going to be generating locally from your own country, because they can't be traded. So that part is just always up in the air. If something can be traded, then you can't control the spigot as well. But here we have services coming out of market squares and services coming out of gas streetlights. And what that means is that the country kind of knows how much we have in our market. And if we want to punish the people who are buying this, we can tax it, but we can also just increase demand for it. And by increasing demand for it at the lower strata, we increase the punishment on the higher strata. So let's go back to one of these like 13s, and then we'll pick out what they have in their basket of goods. And why are there 12? Why are there like 12 dudes over there? Paradox, this is a fresh save. All right, so here we have these guys. They're at 11, and you can see here, services is their 6th, 7th most bought good. 7.4% of their expenditures are going towards services, right? Conversely, if we look at the aristocrats here, and these are not even the richest aristocrats, right? Services, they are already, that's their number one good. It's 19% of their expenditures are services, and that was not even the wealthiest aristocrat. Let's check it. Let's check these guys out. And they've got 30% of their wealth expenditures are their pop needs are going towards services. So what that tells you, or what it should tell you, is that if you are able to make your lower strata, because remember that standard of living, it's by strata, but it doesn't restrict your strata, or it doesn't restrict you, right? You can be a farmer with a 40 standard of living, hypothetically. But what it means is if you can get your lower strata to start competing with your upper strata for goods like this, it's going to hurt your lower strata a lot less than it's going to hurt your upper strata, which is going to in turn reduce their wealth, and it's going to in turn demand that their power goes down. Because remember, their power is going to be coming from their wealth, and if they have to spend more of their wealth on services, then you can really strangle them out that way. But on the other hand, if you don't want to be a monster about using SOL, you can use SOL as a growth vehicle in addition to a weapon. So for instance, clothing, if you have all of your peasants just like bumping around in the 1 through 9, they're going to be buying mostly fabric just for their own clothes, which is simultaneously going to be good for you because it means that your cotton plantations are going to do well, but it's going to be bad for you because it means that like all that fabric isn't going to be around for you to buy as a government. But more important than even that, it means that there's going to be reduced demand for clothes. On the other hand, if you can push your lower strata, again, where most of your pops are going to be, into the 10 plus, they'll start buying clothes. If you can get them above 20 plus, then they'll start buying even more groceries and meat and fruit. At 15 plus, they start to emulate the rich people and buy luxury goods. So if you can get them to the point where they're buying their own luxury goods, because one of the things that you'll find pretty early on in the game is that it is pretty powerful to do stuff like export your luxury clothes and your luxury furniture most of the time, because you can usually just make more of them than you can sell. Whereas most of the time your clothes balance is going to be a lot more negative. But if you can get the SOL of your lower strata pops up to 15 plus, then they'll start substituting in some luxury clothes here. This will also have determining factors on which sort of heating they're going to want to purchase. So obviously, if you are having problems with your coal, then you want to be careful about how quickly you grow your SOL. Because if you get a lot of your pops into the 20 plus, they'll start competing with the government for coal, which can be a disaster for you. But most important, I think, than anything else is simply the way that you're going to, if you utilize growth to grow your standard of living, then you're probably going to be fine. Especially, and I mean like doubly especially, if you utilize not just growth, but like income growth to help them out. Because then you're increasing the velocity of money in your economy. And by increasing the velocity of money, by increasing their income and not really caring about the cost of their goods, then you're going to just increase the amount of money that you can tax, right? Because it's going to be coming from their wages and their expenditures. Whereas if you're trying to keep the costs of things down, then you're very, very directly injuring your ability to get money out of consumption taxes, but you're also very directly injuring your ability to get money out of your pops. Because if you're decreasing the cost on textile mills by importing clothes or whatever, or you're decreasing the cost on clothes by importing clothes, which will in turn hurt the textile mills because they won't have the ability to sell those goods locally, and then the people who are working in your textile mills will have their own SOL hurt. You absolutely can try to do cost balancing here once you get to a certain point, but I would encourage people to largely not worry too much about trying to drive up their SOL by managing that way, because I cannot tell you how many posts on Reddit I see of somebody saying, help, I created a welfare state and didn't have enough construction and not enough imperialism to ensure easy access to resources. And then my pops became extremely greedy, wealthy SOL addicts who just wanted every single good in the whole universe because their SOL was outrageously high. And because they had this incredibly high SOL on everybody, including their lower strata pops, they just couldn't keep up with the demand. And that meant that eventually, because they couldn't keep up with the demand, the price on the goods skyrocketed. And because their SOL had been artificially kept high by having prices on goods kept low, their economies and countries exploded. So if you've had that happen to you, post in the comments. I want people to understand that this is not a bad number. It's also not a good number. It's a number that influences your growth, and it's a number that you can control to influence your growth. There are a lot of different factors that go into determining it, not the least of which is going to be whether or not your people have good income and access to the goods that they need, not necessarily at the prices that they want, but the goods that they need, and that if you're trying to build a good economy, should be very aware of the impact of moving pops, especially lower and middle strata pops, up the standard of living chart. Like, you should absolutely do it. And you should also try to pull your aristocrats down, at least initially, even if that is going to curtail demand for stuff like porcelain, because you can't afford all that wealth and therefore all that power floating around out there. Yep, that's